Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Silvia Mantilla from the World Federation for Animals, and I'll be moderating our debrief on the 30th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP30, which wrapped up over the weekend. A few quick notes before we begin. There is interpretation available in Spanish and Portuguese. Pick up your language via the globe icon. The session is being recorded and we'll share the recording afterwards. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name and where you're joining from. And please jot your questions in the Q&A box as we go. Okay, now let's situate ourselves for a moment. From the 10th to the 21st of November, countries around the world, minus a few notable absences, met in Belém, Brazil, for the annual negotiations on how to respond to the climate crisis for COP30. And these talks matter deeply for animals for at least three reasons. First, animals are already on the front lines of climate impacts. Habitats are shrinking, ecosystems are being disrupted, and many animals are now living in conditions they didn't evolve to survive. Second, the systems that exploit trillions of animals are major climate change drivers. Industrial animal agriculture, aquaculture, and fishing are among the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, and land use change. And third, wild animals are genuine climate allies. Through their natural behaviors, they help ecosystems absorb and store carbon and stay resilient to climate shocks. Yet, animals and their welfare are still largely absent from climate decision-making. And that is why we at WFA, a global coalition of nearly 80 NGOs from around the world, are actively engaging in these spaces to ensure animals are recognized in climate policy and implementation. So COP30 covered a wide range of agenda items, but today we'll focus on the ones with the clearest implications for animal welfare. We'll have the Global Mutirao, the Sharm el-Sheikh Joint Work on Climate Action on Agriculture and Food Security, the Global Goal on Adaptation, UNFCCC's cooperation with other international organizations, and we'll also touch briefly on the Just Transition Work Program, the Belém Health Action Plan, and the emerging Wildlife for Climate process. If this is your first time engaging with the UNFCCC, this is probably sounding like a long list. Don't worry, because we're going to have some great speakers to help us unpack what this all means. We're joined by Kelly Dent, Global Director for External Engagement at World Animal Protection, Sebastian Osborn, Global Policy Manager at Mercy for Animals, and Ed Goodall, Climate Policy Specialist at WFA. Before we get started, I do have one final note. We're 10 years from the Paris Agreement, and the agreed outcomes at COP30 are still far from what is needed to protect people, animals, and ecosystems. And so there may be moments during this debrief when we feel some collective frustration, if not grief. But that's not the purpose of our session today. As we look at what happened in Belém, let's keep in mind why we do this. We analyze these outcomes not to dwell on shortcomings, but to help all stakeholders do better, because animals and the communities that depend on healthy ecosystems deserve better. So with that, let's turn now to Sebastian to walk us through the main political outcomes at COP30, the Global Mutirao, and what it means for animals. Seb.
Thanks so much, Sylvia. So the Global Mutirao was the headline COP30 political outcome. And essentially, it was a political umbrella decision that ties together big themes: keeping 1.5C alive, scaling up finance, and strengthening the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Mutirao is a Portuguese word that comes from the indigenous Tupi-Guarani language that refers to people working together towards a shared goal. The COP30 presidency was keen to emphasize this. And although the presidency stressed that this was not a cover decision, excuse me, it functioned very much like one, bringing together issues that were not on the formal agenda. The COP presidency's approach for negotiating this item of shuttle diplomacy, with the process focused on them liaising directly between different parties, raised a number of transparency concerns, but the text was delivered in the end. And the final Mutirao text calls for tripling adaptation finance, but with no clear baseline year and a target of 2035, 5 years later than an earlier draft. I'll go on to some of the issues that were particularly salient for animals in this. So, the Mutirao decision underlines the urgent need to address, in a comprehensive and synergistic manner, the interlinked global crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and land and ocean degradation. And it also contains wording on the vital importance of protecting, conserving, and restoring for effective climate action. That reinforces and expands on language from the global stocktake 2 years ago and gives us an important political hook. Protecting wildlife and their habitats and transforming food systems are not nice to have add-ons, but central to meeting the Paris Agreement's temperature goals and other goals. However, there is no clear commitment to a fossil fuel phase out in the decision text. There will be only a voluntary roadmap initiative outside of formal UNFCCC processes led by Brazil and partners. There is also no mention of food systems, despite their major role in emissions, land use change, and nature loss. And there's only one reference to deforestation, and it appears in the preamble. It acknowledges the importance of halting and reversing deforestation and forest degradation by 2030, but provides no commitment, no pathway, and no recognition, importantly, of the drivers of deforestation. And this is rightfully seen as a major missed opportunity from an Amazon COP. And to hear more about the issue of deforestation, I'd love to pass over to my colleague on the panel, Kelly Dent.
Thanks, Seb. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so sort of some really interesting dynamics just before I go on to the roadmap, just around the whole process for both the fossil fuel implementation roadmap and also the deforestation roadmap. I think at the halfway point in the COP, we very much thought that we were going to see both of those in the text, and then by the end we didn't. And clearly there were some political moves at play. I think we saw Brazil in the end decide to back the countries like Saudi Arabia, India, Indonesia, and Russia. So the larger, by either emerged or emerging economies, rather than some of the Latin American countries who put up quite a fight in the plenary to try and bring those back into the text. So yeah, I think that outside of the formal negotiations in relation to deforestation, what we'll see is that Brazil will be leading some international discussions on a roadmap for transitioning away from both fossil fuels and ending deforestation with other countries. But these future discussions, which will come to COP 31, they're kind of voluntary in nature. Although things can happen outside COP that drive things within the COP, but for the moment they're not within that formal decision or the Mutirao. And so what that means is we'll continue to see pressure on habitats. We'll continue to see forest conversion. We'll also see that the wildlife rich areas are not sort of protected until we see that an implementation roadmap. I mean, what we've got at the moment is a recognition that we need to end deforestation by 2030, but in fact, no process to get there. So in terms of why this matters for animals, as most people on this call would know, forests, peatlands, and mangroves are home to many animals. And we also know that deforestation is one of the major causes of clearing land for feed for the industrial animal agricultural system. So we see wild animals losing their homes and their habitats to clear land to grow feed for animals who are trapped within the industrial animal agricultural system. So I wanted to move on from the deforestation roadmap, and I wanted to move to the Sharm el-Sheikh Joint Work Program on the implementation of climate action on agriculture and on food security. And so as we often abbreviate it, the SSJWA. So this is the official agricultural and food systems negotiation track under the UNFCCC process, and it's meant to help countries design and implement climate action across agriculture, across food systems, and also ensuring food security. It includes finance, technology, and also capacity building. And the current SJWA is a 4-year mandate. And this has been running workshops. It's developed an online portal of various case studies, that best practice, etc., that parties can draw on. And it's also preparing annual census reports of agriculture relevant work undertaken by various UNFCCC bodies. And this particular 4-year cycle runs out at COP31 next year. This is also the third cycle in terms of agricultural negotiations within the UNFCCC process. So what happened at COP30? So what we saw in Belém was the technical and implementation bodies of the UNFCCC, we often call them the SBs, they reviewed the progress under this particular work stream, including a recent workshop on the topic of systemic and holistic approaches to implementing climate action on agricultural food systems and food security. They also looked at a recent report from the Standing Committee on Finance, which looked at how we would finance sustainable food systems and agriculture. And in Belém, several countries pushed to capture the key messages from the workshop into a formal SJWA decision, but essentially parties ran out of time for this. Now, there's two ways to look at this. I think firstly, you want to see a good outcome, so that if they haven't got enough time, it's better that it is actually postponed, and I'll get to the advantages and disadvantages of that in a minute. It's also true to say that there were some countries that were pushing back on this. The end result is that COP ended without a substantive outcome for this work stream, and countries have agreed to discuss this at their next sessions, which are in the middle of June. So the more technical discussions that happen in the middle of the year. So what this meant is that the draft conclusions are still on the table. So what is going to be reviewed in June? Basically, the pieces that we'll look at in June is an acknowledgement that sustainable food systems encompass the whole value chain, and that goes from production to consumption and waste, and that this is essential in terms of food security and, importantly, is critical in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We'll also see an encouragement for countries to include action on food systems within their national climate plans. the importance of food systems in addressing climate, biodiversity, land degradation, water, and energy. The potential for agroecological approaches or agroecology to be used is also there. However, worryingly, there's also language that emphasise the importance of livestock to livelihoods and nutrition, which could be used to justify the expansion of industrial animal agriculture or livestock production. So I guess why this matters to animals politically, the outcome was we ran a workshop, we need some more time, see you in Bonn to discuss this further. Any substantive discussions on food systems and livestock is parked, and that is clearly a major gap, in one of the biggest emitting sectors in across our economy, and also given that we're at a COP in the Amazon where deforestation is rife. So there was also a missed opportunity there because COP was not able to deliver a clear political signal, despite evidence that we need to transform food systems because of the large share of emissions that they produce. I think it's also fair to say that there's a lack of understanding by many parties on what food systems mean, and a concern by some that they don't lock in language that jeopardizes food security. And we see this emerging in other parts of the text as well. I want to finish up on the good news, and the good news is that nothing yet has been locked into a poor or a bad direction. Livestock-centric language, it can still be improved, and there is still room to push animal welfare into climate resilient farming and food security, and also to look at, just transition in food systems within that next agricultural cycle. Sorry, the next negotiation cycle. So with that, I'd like to bring Seb back in to see if he has any further comment on the SSJWA. And also, I think Seb's going to talk on the global goal on adaptation as well. Thanks, Seb.
Thanks so much, Kelly, and great points on SSJWA. I really wanted to echo and highlight that some of the language in the draft conclusions that will be taken up in Bonn could be politically very significant. So if we get an agreement that addressing all stages of the value chain is core to a systemic and holistic approach and is important, that could help steer an understanding of climate action on food systems away from being agriculture plus additional options towards being a comprehensive approach that includes everything. And similarly, a message on the linkage between food systems and biodiversity could lay a stronger foundation for this to be addressed in future work on cooperation between the conventions. So while it's very promising that these are on the table, this negotiation stream continues to present difficulties. Negotiators from a number of parties are skeptical of a food system's scope, even though their governments, in some cases, are strongly supportive of food systems. So reconciling these divergences within and between delegations will be important for progress at SB 64 in Bonn and COP31 next year. But I now want to turn to another critical negotiation stream, which was the global goal on adaptation. So to give some background, the global goal on adaptation was established in the Paris Agreement to provide a North Star to mobilize action on adaptation, similarly to what 1.5 and 2C, the temperature goals, do for mitigation. And at COP28 2 years ago, parties agreed on the UAE framework for global climate resilience to strengthen and monitor progress towards the global goal on adaptation. So the UAE framework for global climate resilience set 11 thematic adaptation targets for the global goal on adaptation, including one on food and agriculture and one on ecosystems, so areas that are very significant for animals. And it also launched the UAE Belém work program to develop indicators for these targets. Under the UAE Belém work program, experts were convened, and ultimately these experts provided parties with a list of 100 potential indicators across the 11 targets just in September. So at COP30, parties reviewed this list of 100 indicators and adopted 59 somewhat related indicators, which are now known as the Belém adaptation indicators. These indicators are voluntary, they're not prescriptive, and they're intended to inform national approaches to tracking adaptation action. So they don't come with, importantly, with a reporting obligation for countries. Parties also launched the what they call the Belém ADAS vision. It's a 2-year process to develop guidance for using the indicators, along with further technical work that was agreed to be undertaken as well by the Secretariat. So this process was politically difficult. Parties raised a number of concerns in the negotiation. Some of the major ones were which sources of adaptation finance would be tracked, whether national policies could be tracked, the readiness of the indicators from the technical experts for use, and reporting burdens, especially for developing countries. The revised list of indicators emerged at 3 a.m. before adoption. And this final list reflects a degree of political compromise rather than technical consensus. So why does this matter? Well, this is the first time parties have agreed to a structure for measuring adaptation progress. The indicators could be expected to provide a concrete vision of what successful adaptation looks like, and what issues, such as equity in food systems or species protection, matter as part of that. Formally, these indicators will be used to review progress in the next global stocktake, which will take place in 2028. They could also be expected to influence thinking more broadly, for example, about how countries prioritize investment in these areas, or about the focus for private sector action on adaptation. So I now want to turn to the outcome in a little more detail on what happened at COP28 on the GGA indicators on food and agriculture, or at COP30 with the GGA indicators on food and agriculture. So at COP28 2 years ago, as I mentioned, a target was adopted for food and agriculture. And this target was, the wording is attaining climate resilient food and agricultural production and supply and distribution of food, as well as increasing sustainable and regenerative production and equitable access to adequate food and nutrition for all. So Mercy for Animals and others engaged heavily on the food and agriculture indicators, pushing for food systems framing, similar to what we had in the target. That would include, for example, indicators recognizing the importance of food waste as an adaptation issue, as well as healthy and sustainable diets. And we also pushed for the removal of metrics that might encourage intensive production systems. So the final indicators, the 5 indicators that were adopted in Belém, focus on the areas listed on this slide, and I won't read them out since we've got them here for us to take a look at. But I want to jump into why these matter to animals. So one thing to note, first of all, is that all of the food and agriculture indicators, all 5 of these, are novel indicators. They've never been used or reported on before, and they don't have methodologies or metadata on how to do that. And 4 out of the 5 are different at their core than any of those put forward by the technical experts, even though for these 4, there were some superficial parallels in wording between them. As I mentioned earlier, these indicators were a major opportunity to present a robust vision that countries could work towards. Instead, the indicators are unclear and in some cases potentially risky. The indicator on yields, for example, risks giving a narrow focus on maximizing on-farm productivity that might, for example, not account for land use off-farm, or for that's used for feed, for example, or for the use of inputs such as fertilizer, or for negative impacts on animal welfare, such as breeding for excessive growth rates. Still, the door is open for some improvements through refinement of the methodology and metadata under the Belém vision on adaptation, and after the second global stocktake in 2028, when the indicators are due to be reviewed. I'd love to now pass over to Ed to hear more about the ecosystems target and the indicators for that.
Thanks, Seb. So yeah, hi everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to take us now through the ecosystem indicators under the GGA, what they mean through a wildlife function and a welfare lens. So, as Seb said, the overall list was reduced down, and the ecosystem indicators were cut down from 10 original indicators now to 6. And we've lost quite a bit within that, unfortunately. So protected areas disappeared as a measurable metric, which is really disappointing, as there's protected areas are some of the last refuges for many wild animals and where they best deliver their key ecological roles. Restoration dropped out as a defined and countable measure, removing a clear way to track safer, larger, more connected habitats where animals that have high welfare within those restored habitats can deliver their ecosystem service benefits most effectively. Natural ecosystems vanished completely as a category when animal ecosystem roles all depend on natural systems being intact with all of their component parts. And also cultural services was lost, which is a major loss for indigenous peoples whose identities and relationships with nature and species sit within that concept and shape not how just they interact with nature, but how we all do as well. So we lost a lot of specificity within the indicators, but countries can still report well, but weak and inconsistent reporting and use of these indicators is now easier. But the final list of indicators does give us some possibilities for integrating animal welfare and animal ecosystem functioning into adaptation metrics. So I haven't got them up on the screen here, but indicator A under the ecosystem indicators focuses on climate resilient ecosystems and keeps the concept of ecosystem service delivery, which is really important. Earlier drafts of the indicators had split out ecosystem services into food and water and climate regulation, but they're all now folded into this one much broader indicator on climate resilient ecosystems and if they still deliver those ecosystem service benefits. So again, we've lost some specificity there, but the principle is still intact, and it's where animal ecosystem functioning can sit within this indicator framework. But we've got some work now to do with policymakers to show that wildlife and high welfare really underpin and enable those ecosystem services. Indicator B on ecosystems and adaptation actions is where we've lost some of that specificity as well. So it did have stuff like hectares restored and area protected, but all of those clear and countable measures have fallen out now, and we've now just got this much broader category of adaptation actions, which could mean a lot of things. It could mean actual genuine restoration work, but it could also just mean lots of plans on paper. So it could contain wildlife friendly actions, but only if countries choose to use them in that way. So it will need some active encouragement. Indicator C on ecosystem resilience keeps the idea of resilience in the list, but without agreed and internationally recognized metrics, which were in there before, countries now have a wide scope to interpret what resilience means. But it's still a clear conceptual space to recognize the role of animals, because ecosystems are most resilient when species are present at their natural population levels and where welfare is safeguarded. But the lack of those defined metrics does weaken that clarity. We've retained indicators on the threat status of ecosystems ecosystems and species, which is grounded in the IUCN Red List. It's really good that that stayed in. It's likely because they're just very scientifically robust. We've been using them for a long time, and it's hard to weaken that usage. And these really align directly with welfare as well, because if species and ecosystems are classified as threatened, parties should be taking actions to reduce pressures and harms and improve conditions and help populations and habitats recover. And the last indicator on ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solutions kept its place too. And it's also a possible good home for animal roles and animal welfare. It covers ecosystems like forests and mangroves that we know are important for climate mitigation and adaptation. But in practice, many nature-based solutions depend on animal contributions within those ecosystems. And to make those roles visible, countries are going to need support to integrate animals explicitly into their ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solutions work, and to recognize that high welfare is integral to those functions being delivered. So to summarize on the GGA, we've lost a lot of detail, and the indicators are now more broad and open to selective reporting. But they do still give us a way to track how well we're protecting nature as the climate changes. But they're not the only way, as there are many policies across lots of global environmental agreements. And it's important now that we're getting those agreements to pull together in the same direction, given how everything in the global system is interconnected. And I'll hand over now to Silvia, who was tracking this agenda item in Belém.
Thanks, Ed, and thank you, Kelly and Seb, for all the insights on what were very difficult negotiations. Hopefully, I come with more cautious optimism, and then Kelly will follow with even better news. So I'm just going to quickly zoom out before I get into the UNFCCC agenda. So the UN, for those of you who may not be familiar with what the Rio Conventions are, the UN has three major conventions that came out of the Rio Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. It is the UNFCCC on climate change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Convention to Combat Desertification, the UNCCD. They were created to tackle different problems, but in the real world, as Ed was mentioning, those problems are deeply interconnected. We know that climate action taken in isolation can be detrimental for nature. Think of deforestation. It drives climate change, it destroys biodiversity, and degrades land all at once. There are many examples of what the synergies between the Rio Conventions are. For years, scientists and many governments and civil society have said that we won't solve any of this crisis as long as we don't address them together, as long as we continue to address them in silos. So now, going back to the UNFCCC. Under the Climate Convention, there has been a long-standing agenda item called the cooperation with other international organizations. Now, traditionally, this has been very procedural. The Secretariat presents a report, countries take note, and that's usually it. And is normally reported at Bonn during the mid-year talks. But this year, countries saw an opportunity to take forward a discussion on the synergies between the Rio Conventions, and they saw an opportunity to do so under this agenda item. They saw an opportunity to turn this agenda item into something more meaningful. So this agenda item would complement the work that was happening under the Convention on Biological Diversity, under the UNCCD, where there have been already statements and resolutions on the need to bring the Rio Conventions together. So at COP, there were many expectations on this agenda item. In all fairness, it wasn't the most talked about agenda item compared to the global goal on adaptation or the agriculture and food security. But throughout COP, interest continued rising. Expectations were high. There were proposals to create an ongoing discussion space on synergies across the Rio Conventions under the UNFCCC, and to develop concrete recommendations on how to align policies and avoid trade-offs. And the COP30 presidency ran consultations trying to land something ambitious. But in the end, a small group of countries, most vocally Saudi Arabia, which ironically holds the presidency of the Desertification Convention, opposed stronger language, a substantive outcome from COP30 on this. So the final decision that we got is quite modest. In simple terms, it does 4 things. It takes note that countries and observers have submitted ideas on cooperation. It recognizes that the 3 conventions have distinct mandates, but that cooperation is important. It asks the UNFCCC Secretariat to engage more effectively in the Joint Liaison Group, which is the coordination mechanism of the 3 conventions. And it invites governments and observers to submit views by May next year on how to make cooperation with other organizations more inclusive and how to strengthen collaboration with other Rio Convention secretariats. So next year, countries will look at those inputs and decide next steps. And when I say that, is next year at Bonn, we'll continue to see a discussion on this. So yeah, we didn't get a new permanent negotiation track or a joint work program, which was one of the proposals yet. But we did get a COP decision that keeps synergies on the agenda, and it explicitly opens the door for observers, like civil society accredited to the UNFCCC, to help shape what comes next. All in all, what does this mean for animals? Why does it matter? For us, we think that this is a strategic agenda item for animals. A stronger Rio Convention synergy space could finally create room to bring animals, all animals, into climate discussion in a serious way. There are major areas where animals and how we treat them can genuinely unlock synergies across all 3 conventions. On the one hand, we have food systems. Callie was mentioning this earlier. The way we currently produce and consume food, especially industrial animal agriculture, aquaculture, and fishing, is responsible for around 30% of global greenhouse gas emission, is the biggest driver of deforestation. But if we shift towards sustainable food systems with more diverse diets and high animal welfare standards, we unlock what is essentially a quadruple dividend. Better health outcomes, reduced pollutions, more space for biodiversity, healthier soils. It's a win-win-win-win. On the other hand, we have wildlife and ecosystems. Wild animals keep ecosystems functioning so they can absorb and store carbon. We have elephants in the Congo Basin helping forests store around 7% more carbon by the way they move and disperse seeds that help grow carbon-dense forests. We have kelp forests with sea otters that actually absorb up to 12 times more carbon than areas without otters. Or a recent one I learned recently, one that I learned recently, penguins. They help form clouds in the Antarctica that keep the region cool. And these are just a few examples of how wild animals are helping climate action. So yes, the COP30 decision is small on the synergy side, but the political space it opens is meaningful, and animals sit exactly at the intersection of the Rio Conventions. Animal welfare is an example of what the synergies look like. So on that note, there were other decisions that give us more cautious optimism. Callie.
Thanks, Silvia. So I get the opportunity to end, well, Silvia will wrap up, but I get the opportunity to comment on some good news that came out of the COP. And I think probably in terms of the formal decisions, one very positive aspect that we saw was agreement at COP30 to establish a just transition mechanism under the UAE Just Transition Work Program. And the agreement was to come to COP31 with a process for developing this mechanism. Now, the idea behind this mechanism, it's to come up with plans at a national level to transition away from high emission industries towards low emission ones. And it calls for economy-wide approaches. And this would include emissions from industrial animal agriculture as a high emitting industry. So within the just transition decision, for animals, the text is silent, but the sectors explicitly mentioned in this decision are rural economies, smallholders, food production, and this is where a lot of the high emission, low welfare livestock systems sit. So there's a real opportunity within this just transition mechanism to look at ways to transition out of high emitting industrial animal agricultural systems. So yeah, that was a kind of a really positive aspect. It's also an area that civil society has really been pushing for a number of years. So it's really good to see that coming to fruition. I just wanted to touch on two declarations that came out. That there was 7+ declarations. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go through all of them. I've picked two that I think are relevant to us in this area of work, relevant to us, relevant to animals. And the first one is the Belém Declaration on Hunger, Poverty, and Human-Centered Climate Action. Not a very snappy title, I'm afraid. I think that the main aspect of this declaration is that it mentions or acknowledges actually the central role of small-scale producers, Indigenous people, and local communities in ensuring food security and ecosystem stewardship. And it looks at the need to reorientate policies and public support towards sustainable agriculture and food systems. And so I think this declaration, it's not binding, but it can be significant for the parties. It does signal progress. Unfortunately, the flip side of that is that it does place a burden on small-scale producers and forest communities to make the changes needed. It doesn't name industrial animal agriculture and large agribusiness as key drivers of deforestation, of biodiversity loss, and of emissions. And then the second initiative that I just wanted to touch on is the Belém Health Action Plan, or the BHAP. And this acknowledges the importance of prevention, not just management and response. And this is a really important component of One Health, something that all of us are deeply interested and concerned about progressing. So I think there's a real opportunity within this BHAP to take forward within the UNFCCC the kind of concept of One Health. And the other thing that I will mention is that civil society does have a seat at the table, which I think is really important within this declaration as well. So on that, let me hand back over to you, Silvia.
Thanks, Kelly. And yeah, we're quite excited about this one. There was one important moment that may have gone under the radar for many. It came at one of the events we hosted during COP30, where Zimbabwe announced that African heads of states have committed prior to COP30 to endorse a wildlife for climate action agenda and declaration by COP31, so in 1 year time. This commitment that was agreed at the African Union Biodiversity Summit in Botswana does two really powerful things. One, it recognizes that wildlife is essential to climate stability. And two, it calls on the rest of the world to support Africa and its wildlife as part of global climate solutions. So we really applaud this. And I think maybe my colleagues can drop in the chat a link for you guys to read more about this announcement if you're interested in. And that way I can move on to briefly closing in questions and answers while we have a little bit of time. So before we open the floor for questions, I do want to say that there is something that we ought to remind everyone of, and is that yes, many of the COP30 outcomes represent a failure of political will. Some have described it, I've seen online, as a triumph of short-term interest over the common good. For animals, for communities on the front lines, for the Amazon itself, that is painful. But that doesn't mean that we step back. If anything, it makes our work more necessary. And throughout the conference, I kept coming back to a word that a colleague of mine shared with me from the Philippines, padayon. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. It means to carry on despite challenges. And that is what we need to do. With that, I would love to open the floor for questions and or reflections. If you haven't yet, please drop them in the Q&A box. Let me have a look. We have one question for Kelly. Kelly, it says, thank you, Kelly, for the presentation. It seems that the SJWA, the Sharm el-Sheikh joint work on climate action in agriculture, is often a case of kicking the can down the road. Do you foresee this ever changing? What can we do to create more political will?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that there's two ways to answer this. On the one hand, yes, we are kicking the can down the road on the agricultural negotiations. On the other hand, as I said before, I would sooner see people take time to get this right than rush it. Because it was only a week at this COP of technical negotiations before we moved into the political and get it wrong. Having said that, and to go to the heart of the question, what can we do to build more political will? I think there's a number of things. I raised the point about we need to be clear as advocates that food security can be assured while we transition away from industrial animal agriculture towards more equitable, humane, and sustainable food systems. And this is a really key point. Now, most of us know this is possible, but I think that if you're a country in the global south, a country that has food insecurity, you need to be really sure that what's happening is going to maintain food security. And of course, there are ways that this can happen while transitioning towards equitable, humane, and sustainable food systems. So that's one point. I think the second thing is that we are seeing progress. Progress is slow under the UNFCCC. It's not going to transform radically, but we do see progress in many areas year on year. And we are starting to see the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, we are starting to see agriculture being in some of those plans. Now, is it enough? Is it good enough? No. We need to strengthen those. But is it there? Yes, it is. So I think it really is like all sort of advocacy, it really is around looking at where the pressure points are, being able to look at where within the process and outside the process that we can laser focus in on to push the levers of policy change. I think I'll leave it there, Silvia. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. That's helpful. I think I'm just seeing more questions, and there was one on the chat, but let me just read some through, and then I'll invite all panelists to come in. One question is still on the SSJW, Kelly. Says, my question to the panel is, what were the trends in areas of alignment and disagreements under the SSJW between different countries? I'll just give you a moment to think about it, and then I'll just read a couple more. There was another question on also SSJW, which is what lessons can we draw from previous mechanisms, like the Cornivia joint work on agriculture. any recommendations or insights that can help guide how we influence the future direction of agriculture. So I think maybe we can approach those two, given that they are both on the agriculture negotiation track. Then on a different note, and I think maybe this is one for you, Kelly, but also Sebastian, and could you please tell me the best or worst thing for industrially farmed animals resulting from this COP? I'm going to pause there. There are a few more questions, but I'm just going to pause there. If we want to wrap up on the SSJW questions first, Kelly, and then we move on to the best and worst thing for industrially farmed animals resulting from this COP with Seb. Does that sound good?
Sure. Look, I'll kick off quickly on the SSJW, and please others come in, because I know Sebastian's been following this as well. I mean, I think that in terms of some of the fault lines on the SSJW, I think that what we kind of see there is, I think that a lot of countries don't understand what is meant by food systems. And I think there needs to be work to build understanding of what food systems within these negotiations actually mean. I also think that, these are negotiations, right? And within the agricultural work stream, you've got a lot of ministers from agricultural departments and policy officials from agricultural departments, and they often don't speak to their colleagues in climate change and sustainability departments. And then you've got the politics of the countries at play. So for who knows what reason, I mean, one can speculate, but there were parties, including Saudi Arabia, at this COP that were actually holding back progress on agriculture. Now, usually when this happens, it's because they're holding out for something somewhere else. So sort of unlocking that can give us some insights. I don't know, Seb, if you want to come in on the bracket issue that happened on the Sharm el-Sheikh joint work program, because that to me gives some indications of where some of the fault lines are. So let me pause and invite you in for a minute, and then Silvia, maybe we can move on to the other questions.
Yeah, thanks. Seb, sorry, take it, and then maybe you can then move on to the other question, and then back to Gal. Yeah, perfect.
Sounds great. So I think the brackets issue. I mean, I think this shows kind of it really kind of how difficult the process was in some ways. So we thought on Thursday evening that we had an agreement to, under the agriculture negotiations, to bracket the text they had been working on and to put that forward to the session in Bonn in some months' time for further consideration. There was a meeting which I think everyone was expecting to be a 5-minute negotiation to formalize this agreement that had happened before, and it ended up running nearly an hour. And the issue that we had was that Saudi Arabia was asking not just to they weren't happy with the whole text being bracketed. They wanted to additionally add another set of brackets showing around a section of the texts on the key messages from the workshop that they weren't keen on. That would be, I mean, essentially to everyone's view, a redundant set of brackets. So we ended up after some back and forth. It ended up with all the paragraphs in the text getting individually bracketed, which is the same meaning, but took quite a long time and jeopardized the ability to have a text to work from in Bonn. So a very difficult process there. But I'll maybe move on to the best and worst things for industrial farmed animals from the COP. So I think, and I'm interested in any other thoughts panelists have. I think the best thing that we have is probably the openings that this COP gives us, both in terms of, for example, potentially future work under a deforestation roadmap, which could impact wild animals as well as domesticated animals, farmed animals, and also in the language that is being forwarded under the agriculture negotiations for further consideration in Bonn. I think the worst thing was that we're still not seeing food systems make it into the agenda and negotiations. And it's we've seen it in declarations in the past, but these things tend to have a short life when they're not for example, the Emirates Declaration, when there isn't a follow-up process that brings it in. And it was really surprising to see, kind of in an Amazon COP, in a cover text of that length, the fact that we didn't have reference to food systems, especially consumption, inclusive of consumption, or actually any part of the value chain, including agriculture as well. And this is something that isn't compatible with what needs to happen on climate. So with that, I'll pass back to Silvia.
Yeah, but I don't know if thanks so much, Sebastian. Kelly, did you want to also come in on your views on the best and worst for farm animals? Is there anything you'd like to complement?
Yeah, just super quick. I mean, I would agree with everything that Seb put forward. I think for me, I think that the deforestation is double-sided, right? I think that it's good that there is a process to look at getting a deforestation roadmap. It's not good that it actually isn't in the decision, which means that it's going to rely on political will and the ability of Brazil and other key countries to drive it forward. I think that one of the good things for me that came out was what I briefly spoke about with the Just Transition work program and that potential mechanism that in the future could see us be able to transition away from some of the high emitting industries, which would include industrial animal agriculture. So in the interest of time, I'll leave it there, Silvia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both. Thank you so much for the three of you, Kelly, Ed, and Sebastian. It's been wonderful to have this chat. We've talked a lot of what we talked here today, and it's always insightful to hear you share your thoughts with others. I feel like an observer to your conversations, and thank you so much for sharing all your reflections with us today. And thank you so much for the people who joined early morning, early afternoon, late afternoon. Anytime you're joining, thank you so much for your interest in what this all meant for animals. There are a few questions that remained unanswered. I apologize for this. We just ran out of time. But what we will do is get back to you in our response by email. Once we share the recording, we'll make sure that we'll share some answers to those questions. And with that, have a wonderful rest of your day, evening. Obrigada.